Welcome everyone to a Saturday webinar. Today we have Elena Lumen. She is going to report on her dissertation material where she did research on astrology, not so much from the quantitative like Judith Holloway did in our last webinar, but qualitative. A little bit about Elena. She is a traditional Western astrologer. She's also a psychotherapist based in the San Francisco Bay Area. She is a graduate of the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in Palo Alto. And like I mentioned, her dissertation was on the value and appeal of astrology as a system of meaning. And that is the key for what we're going to be listening to today.
First of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm very excited. It's very special for me. It's very personal in many ways, and it's also devoted to my love of astrology. I'm gonna first start with the agenda for our topic. So the subject is astrology and meaning. How we find meaning with astrology. Why do we like astrology? Why, in spite of the reputation by science, astrology remains popular and people turn to it. And how can we investigate the value of astrology? So that's our topic. But before we go into the material, I would like to give an agenda, orientation about what this topic will be structured. The talk will be structured like. So first of all, I want to speak about what astrology is and make one of my main points really for today is it's a system of meaning. It's a contextual system. In itself is a system of knowledge, as a discipline of knowledge. How does it fit within the context of Western philosophy with Western science? So I guess one of the findings of my research is that everything is contextual, right? The meaning is always in context, and therefore astrology provides that context, and how does it fit into the other contexts, right? So it's all going to be very sort of interrelational, right? Both my research and position of astrology in the world, in the Western world. And then I will talk about history of astrology development and research, briefly, again, to picture the context. How did it come to be this way? What do we know? How has it been developing over the centuries? Then I will talk about current studies, which mostly focus on, they all come from natural science paradigm, cause and effect, relationship, one thing causes the other, the paradigm of we are objective observers, we can objectively study something, right? And then I will critique them a little bit, and then I will go on to discuss qualitative research, which has been developing quite well, maybe the last 30, 40 years in psychology, and particularly in my method, phenomenology. I will talk a little bit about its philosophy because it's connected actually with astrological paradigm very well, but it's a respected psychological method of research. And then I will present my study design and the juiciest part, the results of my study, and then I will give examples, and it can be interactive. Audience maybe can ask me questions or reflect on their own chart and what appeals to you in astrology, why you are interested in it. And we conclude with question and answers and maybe some summary discussion of the findings, summary of the findings. So before I begin, I also want to point out that here on my, there's an illustration on that slide. This is from my own natal chart, and this is to serve as a sort of illustration for my motivation to do this research, what moved me to write about astrology and meaning. So as you notice, I deleted other elements of my chart, but those of you who know astrology will see that I have Jupiter and Neptune on my midheaven, right? And Jupiter in astrology means is quest for meaning, quest for truth, the meaningfulness of things, interconnectedness of things. So I have a strong Jupiter in Sagittarius in my chart, right? So it's kind of symbolic of my interest and my professional interest. So now I'm speaking publicly about how we search for meaning with astrology. So, just an illustration and kind of an explanation of why am I doing this or have done this. And with that, I'm moving on to the next slide, where, again, I also included a chart. This is a chart of the moment on the West Coast. So this is how the chart of the webinar beginning appears, right? And again, you will see there's Sagittarius rising for me, from my point of view, right? I'm the speaker, and some of you are on the West Coast as well. And the Sagittarius is the sign associated with the search for truth, quest for knowledge, right? And the Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter. So Jupiter, again, Jupiter rules this presentation, right? That's very powerful now in Cancer. So another synchronicity, another symbolic connection with Jupiter there. And why did I include this in the beginning? Because the premise of the astrology is that that which is above is that which is below. And then, you can see here the quote as superiors as secret quote as inferiors. So the premise is that what is above is connected to what is below, what is happening in the moment. So for me, for example, meaning is very important, right? And the chart of the webinar symbolically represents how Jupiter, the meaning-seeking planet, is very powerful, right? And so, the interconnectedness between the universe and the moment and even the specific person is so very deep. And that brings me to my second slide and my main point, as I already mentioned earlier, that meaning is always contextual. That's what I found in my research, and it correlates with other psychological research. So meaning does not exist in itself. Meaning is something that it's a correlation, right? We always place meaning in some kind of larger context. And astrology is one of those contexts. It's a very global context. It's a transpersonal or spiritual context. Therefore, the globalness of astrology allows us to interrelate our lives, to have a larger picture on it, to interrelate it with a larger context. And also, astrology is a metaphoric language. There's symbology, metaphor in it, right? So metaphors are very potent carriers of meaning. So here's an example. Now I'm talking and you have to listen, right, and understand sort of logically what I'm saying. But here is the diagram is of the famous experiment that seven blind men are investigating the elephant, right, from different sides. And from one perspective, it's, the scientist said it's a snake, and from another perspective, it's a rope, and another one says it's a wall. So are they all wrong or are they right? Each of them are right in from their perspective, right? But they only see one side of elephant. So to seeing something, so it's all both right and wrong, right? So from their perspective, they're correct, but they're not seeing the whole picture. So it's like the metaphor, so the elephant is a metaphor, right? So in order to see, and it's both metaphor for astrology, in order for us to apprehend its value, we have to see a bigger picture. But it's also a metaphor for science, that science is also right, investigating, some elements of astrology, right? And trying to see some kind of side of it. But probably for true appreciation of astrology or true evaluation of astrology, it has to be seen as a system, as a bigger, as an elephant in this. Let's then talk about what is astrology. It's an ancient discipline. It's concerned with planetary influences on human life, human affairs, on character and destiny. And I found a very interesting definition of astrology on Wikipedia, out of all places, where it said, it's in the broadest sense is the search for human meaning in the sky. I thought that was fascinating, right? So astrology is the search for human meaning in the sky. So again, it correlates with that theme of meaning. And then they say, it's been argued astrology began as a study as soon as human beings made conscious attempts to measure, record, and predict seasonal changes by reference to astronomical cycles. So as long as the humans existed, they looked to the sky. They try to sort of correlate their lives to the sky. So the stars and the sky were always very, very important, right? That's a search for meaning. It's some kind of globalness of the universe that attracts us, right? Human is attracted. And I think that the search for meaning, I think, and a lot of researchers say that is one of the paramount drives in the human psyche. And so here I included two illustrations. But that's another principle that I wanted to discuss, that in the view of astrology, the universe is one interconnected system where microcosm and microcosm are reflected in each other, right? So we as humans look out to the sky, trying to understand the universe, trying to understand ourselves, right? And the sky, they reflect something back to us. And so here are the illustrations. On top, there is atom, the structure of the atom, right? So that's the nucleus, the center of the atom, and the electrons on the periphery, right, on the sort of elliptical orbs. And at the bottom, there's a picture of the solar system. So even, the resemblance is very interesting, right? Very almost striking, I would say. So here's one analogy, right? The universe, the system, our solar system, and the structure of the atom, how similarly they are structured. A couple more principles of astrology. Here's the modern representation, which I kind of like. That's how we see horoscope in two-dimensional format, right? But here's a three-dimensional. So in astrology, we feel that, or it's believed, right? It's been believed that solar system has particular significance because it is surrounding the ecliptic, right? This is the path of the Earth around the Sun. But other fixed stars, other asteroids also have meaning. So our system, specifically zodiac, the planets of our system, asteroids, some fixed stars that are connected to the ecliptic, to our, the path of the Earth around the Sun, are very significant to us. And why is that? It's believed the zodiac, well, I mean, outside of that, that is a system, and we're part of that system, right, a smaller part, but it's believed that zodiac radiates different type of psychic and physical energy, and that energy is carried to the Earth by the planets of the solar system. And, as many of you probably know, or, if you're interested in astrology or practicing astrology, then planets represent important archetypes of life, important principles of life. So coming back to my earlier example, for me, Jupiter is a strong archetype personally, right? And then it's an archetype for the meaning, which today the rules, the chart, the beginning of the webinar. There are other archetypes: Venus, archetype of beauty and relationship; Mars, archetype of energy, drive, force, and so on. So the planets are the carriers, and they carry this energy to us, to the Earth. There are many different systems of astrology, and I would like to emphasize that this presentation focuses on Western astrology simply because that's what I'm more familiar with, and that's what's practiced here in the West. But even with the different, Western versus Eastern principles, all systems of astrology, well, they are deeply rooted in their philosophical and spiritual beliefs present in their cultures, but they also, so they have some differences, right? Again, that's contextual, it's based on the cultural background. But there is something that all of them share, and that is that macrocosm and microcosm, they're very sympathetically connected. So all systems agree that there's an interconnectedness, the reflection of big and small, and vice versa. So here are, again, two other examples which I think are interesting. That's on the left is the structure of the cell, of human cell, with the nucleus at the center, and different parts of the cell. And on the right, this is a structure of the planet Earth. So even just looking, you can see the resemblance. You can see the correspondence between the two. Again, one more thing. The way that astrology sees, there's this thing about faith and free will, right? But that I'm going to talk more about as we go on through the presentation. But astrology, basically, traditional astrology, or philosophers of astrology, they always believed, they thought that astrology provides a sense of security. It helps us align our wills, our life with the faith, with the divinity, and act in accordance with it. So astrology was not just a deterministic science, that stars, they do something to us, right? And then we are passive receivers of that. It's more about interconnectedness of us aligning, the smaller with the bigger, right? Or finding guidance from the bigger. And so within the different traditions of astrology, right now, in the Western world, there's not modern Western astrology. Again, that places more emphasis on individual free will. We in the modern astrology, we feel that people who practice it, they feel basically that individual has many choices, that planets and stars, they show potential, right? It's a potentiality. We can do different things with it within the promise, within the potential of the planet. But basically, it's up to us. That free will is bigger, is stronger, right? And the planets are archetypes. They seem like as archetypes of collective energy. In the traditional sense, as I was saying earlier, Western astrology sees it interaction between us and the stars. It's like a fate and free will. Together they create a man, right? The fate and free will create the life of a man. But traditional astrology always revered astrology and felt that it was a science, a system of guidance, a system of aligning one's will with the divine order. And the Eastern astrology, I will just mention it briefly, is also very rooted in belief in karma, in that we reap the consequences of the previous actions, right? So there's fate in that sense, but there's also free will. We have choice, to make those changes. So so in all systems of astrology, faith and free will come together, right? It's the emphasis on what's more, of faith or free will, or how they interact. That sort of makes a difference, and that emphasis is based on culture and in the current moment, right? So later we will talk about how, I will say a little bit how a view of astrology changes as our philosophy changes, as our sort of worldview changes. And a little bit of history of Western astrology, just because it's fascinating. It is, and again, probably the first observations, we don't have the traces of that, but the first observations, as long as humankind was alive and developing, there was interest in the stars and the planets. But the Western astrology, what we know, it dates back as far as 3000 BC, and it comes from Babylonia, Chaldea, and Egypt. So originally the observations were connected with the movements of the sun and the moon, right? Because they are very prominent, very important in our lives. The change of seasons, the agricultural advances. And later, systemic observations were confirming the movement of the stars, then later the aspects, right, the relationship between the stars. All of it was mostly concerned with the sun, the moon, the planets, right, their movement. But predictive astrology, the way that we kind of know it now, started to emerge with the discovery of zodiac that happened in Babylonia sometime around 700 BC. So it's a long history. And even prior to that, there are scriptures, there are stones that sort of signify that people were interested in cosmos. They were interested in, universe. So here, in this slide, I included one of the first found the historical facts, right? That's a tablet of Amisadukwa. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but that's scripture of which describes quality of Venus, the rising and setting of Venus, and its properties. It already has significations and explanation that Venus is a beneficial planet. A lot of what Western astrology is today comes from the Greek Hellenic tradition. And the Greeks, they sort of inherited, they took over the knowledge gathered together by Chaldeans, by Egyptians. When Alexander the Great conquered Chaldea, so the Greeks got access to that, to the information, to the philosophy, and they developed it greatly. The Western astrology as we practice it today greatly was nourished and influenced and developed in the Greek period. Because the Greek period is so very important for astrology and for the Western science in general, I'm going to mostly focus on that because, interestingly enough, we think that the science progressed over those years and we're like in some different paradigm. But truly, the foundation of even the modern science, even the way that we look at the world, whether that's more spiritually, metaphysically minded, or is more empiric, it's truly all of the roots, they're going back to the Western, to the Greek philosophical thought. So from that point of view, I want to give some examples, some ideas, and I'm going to focus on that, how that relates to astrology we practice now. The idea of this dual legacy, right, the way that we are developing is not mine. Richard Tarnas spoke about it and beautifully, elegantly described it in his book, The Passion of the Western Mind, and actually it blew my mind when I was reading it, how much of it is still present. So what ideas which originated 2,000 years ago, they're still influencing us. They're still creating a context of the way we see the world. And so basically this legacy, there are two parts of that. There's one side of it which basically believes or feels that nature is divine, but it can be understandable by reason. And I capitalized reason here because by reason they mean human capacity to understand, to think, to search for things. So it was also a divine aspect of us, right? So there's divinity, there's mystical aspect of nature, but we can understand it. We can apply our mind to comprehend it, to know it. So that's one side of the legacy. And another side was that we don't need to look for some kind of mythical or supernatural causes in the universe. We have to actually study the world as it is empirically. We have to be skeptics, we have to be naturalists, and then we can understand it. There's no need for what they called anthropomorphic projections. In other words, when we attribute some kind of mystical meaning, that's our projection. We project something into it, and there's no need for it. We can just simply study what is. And that legacy, you will see it again and again, how it sort of expressed itself in the split between search for mystical, but at the same time myth and projection, and how are the meanings actually, are the meanings something that we project to the sky, or is it something that we derive from the sky, right? And there's this other leg, right, other side of the science, to reject the mythical, to reject the mythological, and simply only study the facts, only the things that can be measured, seen, observed, experienced. Within the first leg, right, divine nature, the first part of that legacy, divine nature and reason. Plato and Aristotle are really, paramount thinkers in Greek philosophy, and they really, truly, their ideas still sort of penetrate our understanding of life, right? So they, at least that part, right, the part which is seeking to understand divine with reason. So they believe that behind the world exists a deeper meaning. Again, notice there is a meaning, right? So that even from philosophical point of view, there is always the search for meaning. So this meaning in some senses is both rational and mythic in character, which is reflected in the empirical order, but which emanates from an eternal dimension that is both the source and the goal of our existence. So there is a divinity, but again, it can be understood. We can try to comprehend it. And as you can see from within this point of view, astrology was seen as a science of divinity. And by the way, from the beginning, astrology and astronomy were inseparable. They only separated over the years, and especially after the scientific revolution in 1700. But truly, they were the same science. So there was no separation between mythical, right, divine aspects of it, and the empirical observations of how planets move, or they rise and set, and things like that. And so astrology was seen and practiced for many centuries as a science of divinity. No split, no conflict. So Plato was saying, and it was very much valued as a science of divinity. And Plato was saying, none can ever be found fairer and more accessible to all mankind, or set in a more excellent region and more eminent in purity, majesty, and fullness of life than has been shown in the fashioning of them, of heavenly bodies. So the reverence for astrology, understanding that this is our sort of guide, an opening to the understanding of divinity, was, very prominent and very clear. And astrology was seen as a science of divinity, as a guide to align our lives with divinity. And so within that, for the centuries, traditional astrology was evolving, holding that reverent view. And, later on, I talked about, the astrology being a guide for aligning one's will with the divine. Never it was seen as a just purely deterministic force. But later on, for example, practitioners and astrologers like William Lilly, they were saying that astrology should be only used for finding guidance for the questions originating in the soul. It shouldn't be used for trivialities, and like now we see in the mass media, for example, right, with the popularity of astrology, oftentimes it is actually said that it's used for entertainment. So traditional astrologists would never view it this way, would never even look at it this way, right? For them it was a very revered science, and it was originally only accessible for chosen people, the priests, the very educated people, right? As the education and information became more available to people, it changed, but still was very revered, as a very special science. And actually, right now, I want to mention that because for me also the traditional astrology becomes very important. There's a big revival of traditional astrology, with many traditional texts being translated, texts that have not been available for forever in English language. They only might have been available in Latin. So now there's a whole flurry of traditions, even from Islamic or Arabic cultures, right? Traditional astrology, Greek astrology, French astrology. So lots of things are available. So people who are interested in astrology and even scientists can investigate, can learn more. So traditional astrology becomes more accessible to us, and we can use the wisdom that's inherent in this, in it. But moving on to a different slide, the other thing within that view, the Greek view, there was lots of mythology and archetypes that are connected with the planets, right? And so, for example, early Greeks believed that how did we actually get to the psychological astrology, right? How did astrology become more archetypal? It's because even the early Greeks associated the gods and goddesses and the qualities of the gods and goddesses, which were like mythological, with the planets. And they believed that orderliness of the cosmos was a testament to the unchangeable, transcendent, and perfect divine. So even Newton, he was writing history of astrology, which I found very interesting. He wrote here on top of the slide, you can see his quote. It may be presumed that they, he writes about Egyptians, continued to observe the motion of the planets, for they called them after the names of their gods. By assistance of Petrus Ceres, a priest of Egypt, he invented astrology, grounding it upon the aspects of the planets and the qualities of the men and women to whom they were dedicated. Here we see that how the psychological aspect, mythological aspect of astrology started to develop. That's actually extremely important. That myths and meaning are very much interrelated, the metaphor. In many traditional research and many modern research, it is shown that metaphors are very helpful, actually very influential in finding meaning, right? And so if we go back to classics, to Aristotle, he was saying like 2,000 years ago, metaphor is a sign of genius, since a good metaphor implies an intuitive perception of the similarity in dissimilar. So I want to slow down here. So from divinity and reverence of astrology, we come to how myth and meaning interrelate. And then again, the question comes, are the meanings then created, or are the meanings, do we create the meanings, right, and project them into those myths, or do we get the meanings from the myths? It's probably both, right? It's the same. So what originates? The myths reflect something in our culture and our understanding, and we attribute the cultural meanings to it, right? We attribute something about the world, but at the same time we derive more personal meanings from the myths. So the whole direction of mythology, archetypes, gave the direction in astrology, which now I would call, which probably developed into the psychological astrology that we know today is very potent, very powerful, and lots of us, when we start astrology, like for example, when I started studying astrology, it was all about psychological astrology, and I find it, as a psychologist especially, find it very fascinating. I get a lot of information about the charts of my clients, right, just psychological, without, thinking about how their life events might be, the psychological archetypes. So within the sort of this myth and mythology, there are many prominent astrologers and thinkers, and I will talk about them a little bit, but one of them is Liz Green, who's very well known for her work in mythology, and this is what she thought about why myths are important and how that connects with astrological mythology. So she feels that myths are self-portrayals by the psyche of its own processes, and they're not only images of life patterns, they are also modes of perception, which color the individual ways of seeing and experiencing his life. They appear both inside and outside as qualities of soul and as worldly ends. So again, there's this dual quality, right? There's something that we experience internally, and there's something that we experience externally. So we started this webinar. I started when Jupiter is ruling it, ruling the ascendant. So Jupiter externally right now is in charge, right? In charge of the ascendant, and internally, for me, it's about meaning, And by the way, earlier I wanted to, for you to reflect on your own chart if you know it, and see if you have strong Jupiter. What planet is strong? Sort of what brings your interest, for example, in this presentation. I suspect that many people have strong Jupiter in the audience, right? But again, it's a question to you, so reflect on it. Continuing with the archetypal psychological astrology, it very much is influenced by psychology and Carl Jung's ideas too, right? So there's an idea of archetypes. That's something it doesn't have a form. Archetype is a pattern of life, something that's common to life, but it has many manifestations, many forms. And so the Carl Jung's ideas are very influential in psychology, and they also influenced astrology. So they influenced Liz Green, and there were other theorists and other thinkers, such as Dean Rudyard, Stephen Arrow, Zibber Dobbins, Liz Green, and many, many others. I cannot mention all of them. But anyway, their perspective, which is mostly like a modern psychological astrology, is to not to take astrology as a deterministic framework, as a framework of fate, but move it towards a map of consciousness, a map of mind, right, like development. And here's the quote by Dane Rudyard, who is considered also one of the fathers of the modern psychological astrology. He, by the way, also spoke about how astrology is a language of meaning. It's one of the most important qualities of astrology. But anyway, astrology presents to an evolving personality, perhaps groping in unconsciousness and psychological immaturity, the archetype of the potential selfhood, that which he will be if he becomes what he potentially is. An archetype is like a seed, the potentiality of a particular structure of organic being. The seed may never grow into a fully developed plant, but if it grows, it will become an actuality, what the seed contains in potentiality. So it's all about potential. Astrology deals only with potentiality, never with a definite or fated event from that point of view. That's kind of a broad summary of the way astrology developed within the first side of Greek legacy, right? The divinity together with, or myth, mysticism, right, and astrology. And that brings me to the other side of it, right, to the empiric side. So we think that scientific revolution brought the changes, right, and perspective, and made the separation between the science and astrology, or science and religion. But actually, even 2,000 years ago, even in the Greek Hellenic period, already there were schools of thoughts that were pursuing that. And what the science today, the way the science today is, greatly depend on or developed from those ideas originating 2,000 years back. And so this other side of Greek philosophical thought was about empirically studying the world, getting to know it as it is without looking for some kind of supernatural explanations. And there were, empiricists, there were rationalists, there were skeptics, like, sophists. They were questioning things. They were saying that we need to look for the answers within the humanly useful truths should be sought in the corporeal world, not in the intangible outwardly reality. And that's essentially their point of view. So with advances in science, especially after the 17th century, after the change in the perspective, right, before people were thinking that the Earth is the center of the solar system, right, of our universe, but then they discovered, for Copernicus and other scientists, that it's heliocentric, right, the sun is the center of our universe. And it started this revolution in science, and eventually science separated from religion, separated from mythology, and didn't want to rejected the mythological supernatural elements, in explanation of the world. And so, within that paradigm, astrology has no place because it is mythological and, is based on this idea of divinity or interconnectedness. So because this perspective, empiric perspective, became the basis of modern science, astrology could not fit into it. It's rejected for its mythological nature and inexactness. I talked about this. I'm not going to talk much about it more, but I want to make a point that up until 1700, astrology was not only revered by astrologists, right, but it's considered a respectable science, even was studied in the universities. It was studied in connection with other disciplines, alchemy and a little bit of medicine. But after the 17th century, after the revolution, scientific revolution, it basically remained ignored, rejected, sort of in the back burner. But in the 20th century, there has been a revival in revival of interest in scientific study of astrology, and that resulted in many studies of research, which I will present in a moment. But all of them were rooted in this paradigm of empiricism, right? Because that's the paradigm which is a foundation of the modern science. The main criticism of modern science of astrology, it's inexact, right? It's, even aside from supernatural causes, right? It's inexact. You cannot produce the predictable results, and therefore it's not valid. We should not then consider it. So Ptolemy is one of our, foundations of Western astrology, fathers of the Western astrology, the way that we practice it today. He wrote, again, 2,000 years ago, which amazes me that, 2,000 years ago, people had insight, right, that is still modern, that is still applicable to today. So he said, well, it cannot be an exact science because it actually deals with human behavior, and it's necessarily unpredictable. There is free will, there's human behavior, there's elements of internal experience, external experience, so it cannot be precise, but we cannot reject, he also said, we don't reject navigation, for example, because something is incomplete in navigation, or some other sciences which, medicine, that, for example, a medical doctor wants to know the history of the patient before they can make some kind of recommendation. So we cannot reject astrology because it's inexact, or because astrology, for example, is trying to understand their client and trying to place this understanding in the context, so the context of the chart within the context of the person's life. These are not the causes to reject astrology. So astrology is not an exact science, but therefore, or a discipline, but we still can study it. And that brings me again to the modern research. So many studies have been done, but they all rooted in the philosophy of natural examination, and they have a few basic principles that run them, right? So even the empiric studies, which are actually supposed to be free of bias, they're deeply rooted in philosophy. So I want you to notice that there's nothing, no meaning, whether that's found through science or through astrology or through philosophy, is actually free for some kind of presuppositions, foundations, some kind of ideas that are at the foundation of it, right? So meaning is never free of any context. So therefore, meaning found with the scientific research is within the context of that philosophy. And so the philosophy of modern research is there is cause and effect. Something causes some kind of variable, some kind of thing or event or situation or energy causes some certain outcome. So let's say, maybe Jupiter, if we look at it this way, right, maybe Jupiter causes me to be interested in meaning, right? Then there's this other idea of stimulus-response relationship, right? So some energy or variable acts, and it causes the response. I talk and you listen, right? So, I produce the sound, so your ears receive it. And then the other one is the observer is independent of the observed. And that's probably the paramount flaw, or one of the flaws of natural paradigm and application to astrology. We're not truly independent of what we observe. We only know objects through our perception of them, right? So, and in astrology especially, it's true because when an astrologer interprets the chart, this is filtered for his intuition, for his understanding. So her mind, culture, all of this take place. So he uses the archetypes, the symbols of astrology, but he filters them for himself. So there's no separation between astrologer's mind and interpretations that he derives. But modern research would want to study it as more of an objective, right? That we are independent of the phenomena that we observe. So the astrological effects should be observable, independent of us. And then modern research is very concerned with quantities, facts, rather than qualities. And again, facts rather than essences. So what do I mean by that? So fact is something we can describe, measure, classify, right? But essence, facts, for example, they don't describe necessarily. Sometimes they describe the phenomenon, but sometimes not. But essence is something that constitutes the phenomena, the experience. For example, think about when you're feeling angry. Is it quantifiable? Possibly you can say I'm very angry or I'm, a little angry, right? But what is the essence of being angry? So if you wanted, let's say you're a Martian and you came from from Mars and you don't know what anger is, would those numbers, would they explain to you what anger is? So probably not, right? So the essence, the internal essence of experience is what the social sciences are concerned with, and that's what astrology is most, maybe not only what astrology is concerned with, but very concerned with the essence of some kind of experience, internal experience. In the last 80, 90 years, dozens and dozens, maybe even hundreds of studies have been conducted to test astrology validity. And they produced, sort of as to be anticipated, to be expected, they produced contradictory results. Sometimes, results are positive, sometimes are negative, and I will give you a few examples just in a moment. But it's actually sort of to be anticipated because there's no, in astrology, it's not a cause and effect relationship. It's a systemic thing. It's objective and subjective together. But let me give you a few examples and, you can judge for yourself. So, for example, very famous man in astrology and in science, Michael Guggenheim, he had done so much for astrology. He had studied very statistically, very from the point of view, empiric approach, he studied astrology, and he was very fascinated with astrology. So he studied many things, introversion, extroversion, connection between the profession and the sun signs. And he basically concluded in many of these things that many basic postulates of astrology, things that we use, they don't find support in statistical research. But what he did find, I even included his picture where he presents his so-called Mars effect. He actually found that Mars was either rising or culminating. So rising would be here on the horizon, or culminating will be on midheaven in the charts of the prominent sportsmen. And he also found that there are general correlations, pretty broad correlations between the profession of the people and the archetypes, astrological archetypes. So, for example, people with stronger Venus tended to be more frequently musicians, artists, painters, artistic professions. People with strong Mars, by strong I mean it was either rising or culminating, right? So if it was an ascendant or midheaven, they were sportsmen or doctors and so on. So, but that research kind of had been forgotten. What is remembered is a Mars effect, right? So because the Mars effect studies, Gauguin himself made a few studies on very, very large samples. In one study he had 17,000 people. Then in another study he had like 3,088 people. So he did himself many studies, and he showed with statistical significance that Mars is prominent in the charts of people who are like eminent athletes, for example. Then there was so much controversy and polemics about his research. Other people did the studies hoping to, replicating study, hoping to prove that he's wrong, but actually they came up with the same result. But then other people, yet other group of scientists did that, and they said we didn't find it. So the whole controversy and polemics about this was going on for a number of years, maybe 10 years or so. Essentially, scientific community disregarded his findings, and they criticized. They found two reasons why they couldn't be valid or shouldn't be valid. Is that one is that supposedly Gauguin didn't use the statistics right, and that there was some kind of bias in choosing the data. For example, they said that he chose only the athletes who were born in the cities and they were prominent, but he didn't compare them to those who were born in the villages. Anyway, all sorts of arguments and explanations came from that, but it came to that it cannot be true because there are artifacts, those results are not significant, the statistics are wrong, or he was biased in his selection, even though that criticism is pretty weak in itself, because he used selections of 17,000 people or 3,000 people, huge selections of people. So even with the replication of his studies, basically they were ignored, and they didn't prove anything. Then there were other studies, and I very briefly will tell what they were, just for for those people who are interested in sort of what was investigated in astrology. There were many studies, and I gave some examples here, on sun signs, extraversion and introversion, right? And they also produced inconclusive results. Again, I want to say that even within those studies, they didn't use the same definitions, same operational variables. They, some people used the sun signs, other people used the seasons, right, to see, when more people with, for example, extraversion are, or when more people with mental illness are born during which season. So there was like differences in the way they even defined the variables which they're testing. But the point is results were inconsistent. And, in the most recent study, this the one which I put on top, Clark, Gabrielson, Barnes in 1996. So they studied, they took the sun sign, the moon sign, and the ascendant and tested it against the extraversion and introversion scores. So they found that people with the sun and the moon in the masculine signs tend to be more extroverted with significant statistical significance, so it's not random. However, the people who have the sun, the moon, and ascendant in the masculine signs, there was no statistical significance in their extroversion, right, level of extroversion. So again, it was inconsistent. And if those of you who are listening who are astrologers would probably think that how do we define extroversion or introversion? How would you identify a client if a client is extroverted or introverted? Would you only consider his sun sign or the moon sign, or even three? You probably would consider the strengths of his planets. Are they below the horizon, above the horizon? What's dominant? So you would consider a multitude of factors to determine if someone is actually extroverted or introverted. So that's one criticism of this. Yeah, then there were studies about moon cycles and homicide suicide. Again, some have shown statistical significance, others didn't. So again, inconsistency in the results. And then there were studies more towards the sort of subjective value of astrology, why people are interested in it, why, in spite of science's rejection, they turn to astrology and find it interesting and fascinating. Because for all this time, astrology is immensely popular and has been very popularized last in the 20th century, 21st century. So these studies found that there are psychological benefits in studies of astrology, and that sort of correlates with my own finding. And so I will talk about it more when we get to my research design and my findings, and I will see how that correlates. Brief criticism of the studies. They are not free of paradigm limitations and biases, as I said earlier. They are actually rooted in a certain view. They're not able to study internal experiences, and they're not able to study something as a system. They're not able to study, they study only the elephant from different sides of the elephant. They're not actually seeing the elephant, using the metaphor here. And they use different aberration variables. They're not consistent in definitions and how they approach astrology. The final point probably here is that, but even when they find positive results, can they actually fit in the paradigm of modern science? Can the modern science accept that astrology works when the premise of astrology doesn't fit in the paradigm of the modern science, which is there are no supernatural causes in the universe, right? So I'm wondering often if the biases, both the methods and the bias of modern science is that to reject the mythological, supernatural, or things that suggest divinity, that by a priori they cannot prove it, or cannot integrate the positive results, even if the positive results are found. So again, can astrology be validated for natural science at all? Frankl is one of the very well-known psychologists who survived Holocaust. He went through concentration camps, and his whole philosophy was about how meaning helps people to survive even the most horrendous, difficult experiences. So he's basically the psychologist of meaning, right? But he was speaking about dimensional ontology. So here you see, when you look at the three-dimensional figure from two-dimensional plane, right? You might see a circle, right, or spheres, or you might see, if you look from a different side, like with the same metaphor or diagram as with the elephant, right? What do you see? From the two dimensions, you might see a square, or from a different two-dimensional perspective, you might see circle. But in reality, this is a three-dimensional object. So in application to astrology, it means can it be studied with a system that has less dimension than astrology itself? And the answer is yes, but it will produce dubious results which are inconsistent. Bulgarian argued that it could be studied because there are physical manifestations. Modern astrological writers, for example, Glenn Perry, many others, say actually it cannot because it's a subjective science, right? So there's a split between objective and subjective, but the truth is astrology is a complex. It has both subjective and objective element to it. There is a need for systemic research that will investigate objective and internal and external. And actually, that's not only an application to astrology. Psychologists like Maslow criticized the approach. The causal approach is very prominent in social sciences, psychology. Like I said earlier, how can you evaluate what anger is? Is it only measurable, or is there some kind of essential quality to it? So Maslow proposed we need to stop that thinking, right? Cause and effect way of thinking, because it's not in tune with the universe, right? The universe, if you look around, we see there's lots of systems. We live in the solar system. Earlier I showed, the atom is a system, the cell is a system, cell is part of the system of the body. So there are lots of systems, small and big, in the world. So in order to be, at least in social sciences, this is not to deny measurements, but in social sciences we need to approach things as a system. And so phenomenology, there are many qualitative studies which have been developing, and they're respected now, and they're more accepted than psychology. But phenomenology is particularly one of them, which is very oriented towards a systemic approach, and also avoids subject-object dualism. So, I'm not the scientist, I'm the scientist, and I'm objective, right, about my participants or research. No, actually, I'm part of the research itself, right, and my mind participates in it, interprets, influences. So some people might say or object and say, well, But then if it's subjective, how could you know that it's true, right? Maybe it's only true for a single person. For example, maybe the Jupiter symbolism is only true for me, right, as a person who is interested in astrology. But the validation of qualitative research is because the principles which are found in qualitative studies, they're applicable to other similar phenomena. For example, in my study, I found that meanings are contextual, right? There's absolutely no meanings that exist in themselves. They always within the context of philosophy or science. So, apply it to anything, right? Even to narrower sphere. So what are the meaning, like in a computer, let's say in a computer and IT technology, what meanings are there, and do they apply? How do they apply? They somehow fit within the context of IT philosophy and technology, right? So the meanings are relative. That's my finding, and it's applicable in any concrete situations, right? So that's or in any specific subject. So that's how qualitative research is validated. That is, if it's true, then it's applicable to other phenomena of the same nature. And when I will present my research results, I invite you actually to see, does it apply to you or it doesn't, right? So if it applies to you, then there is some truth in it, right? And there is something that's common to more than one person or more than just the participants of my study. So with that, I would like to transition to phenomenology a little bit. And this is a lot of philosophy today. I'm talking a lot about philosophy, so sometimes it can be a little bit heady. But again, I invite you to think about if you do charts, right? How is that you interpret the chart? How does this meaning come up in you, right? So you look at the chart and you interpret the symbolism, you filter it somehow inside of yourself, you evaluate it, and then you come up with some kind of, either for yourself or for the client, with some kind of interpretation. What's objective in that? What's subjective in that? Where do you end in this process, and where the objective knowledge of astrology, like, those planets mean this and the zodiac means that, how do they integrate? So, take a second and reflect within yourself. Because the promise of, or the idea of phenomenology is there's no way to know anything. There's no actually separation between us and things that we're learning about, right? So Merleau-Ponty, one of the great theorists of phenomenology, said, consciousness does not begin to exist until it sets limit to an object. And even the phantoms of internal experiences are possible only as things borrowed from external experiences. Therefore, consciousness has no private life. And the only obstacle it encounters is chaos, which is nothing. In other words, it's very complex, right? But the consciousness only knows itself through meeting an object. Right now I'm looking at a computer, I'm looking at the chair, and now I know that I'm here, I'm thinking, I'm seeing this object, I'm thinking about what I'm saying. But without these objects, there's no consciousness, right? And the same way, the objects, they don't exist. Well, maybe they exist, but that's irrelevant, because if I'm not aware of them, they don't exist for me, right? So there's no separation between object and subject, consciousness and, things that we discover. So phenomenology says when you study something, approach it as a system. You're part of it. And that actually reminds me, one of my professors, sort of an anecdote I want to share, one of my professors at Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, she was a great scientist, a traditional scientist, a medical doctor, and her sort of catharsis came, the difficult time came when she was doing the research, and she noticed that the research results were actually influenced by her thoughts. So she expected, in one study she expected a certain result, and it came out. Then she thought of something else, and that completely different thing came out. So she started to notice that the results of her studies were very influenced or in connection with what she was thinking or expecting to get out of the study. And that just made sort of revolution in her mind, because she was trained as this empiric objective scientist, and she just couldn't sort of sit with it, right? So that turned her away from the science, traditional science, started her on a search of more spiritually minded, or like the science which encompasses this thing. How could that be accounted for? Like the object-subject dualism didn't really work for her anymore. So it brings me to my own research design, which is pretty straightforward. There were 6 participants actually in the beginning, but there were, in the end, there were only 4, because some didn't want to ask me to withdraw because of the privacy and information they shared, and some I disqualified because it wasn't related, it wasn't, astrology wasn't revealed enough. They didn't know enough astrology to explain how they use it, right, in their lives. So there were 4 participants, a small amount, but in phenomenology it's acceptable, it's fine. You don't have to have 500, because each person, I had an interview with them, and I asked them a question to provide examples, how they use astrology in their lives. How do they understand something in their lives? I also asked them, are there benefits and drawbacks to using astrology in their lives? And then I spoke with them for an hour, asking a question, and we're giving me different examples, and then it was transcribed word by word. So that created hundreds and hundreds of pages of data, of raw data. So each of them, of this data, has some kind of theme, some kind of element, and I analyzed it with the phenomenology. But I want to come back to the point that you do not have to have a lot of participants, because each participant's phenomena, right, the description of what they experienced, was very, very rich and contained a lot of material and data in there. And again, because it is a phenomena that I'm interested in, right, the phenomena, not the quality of it. It's a quantity, not the quantity, but the quality. Therefore, a smaller amount of participants was sufficient. So when I collected this data, and I got, I think, 300 pages of transcribed interviews, I analyzed it using phenomenology. And the essence, I'm not going to go in a very great detail, because I realize this lecture tends to be very philosophical, so it might be difficult, a little bit difficult to follow. It's easier to ground it in something more concrete. So I analyzed it, and the essence of this analysis is to reduce what is not essential. So I actually, here's the picture for you to look at and see. This is Tree of Life by Klim. So look at this picture and think about it phenomenologically. So phenomenological principle is remove what is not essential and only leave what is essential. So look at this picture and decide for yourself, can anything be removed from it? And would it make it different, right, or less essential, or does it have to stay as it is? So similarly to this picture, in my research, I have to leave only the elements which cannot be removed. If I remove them, that's not going to be the same thing, the same phenomena anymore. So for example, in this picture, I would not remove anything. I think it will alter the composition, alter the, the ultimate impact that the picture makes, right? So these are the essential elements. There's a tree, there are people, and so on. But in phenomenology, there are many, in the narratives, when my people were talking, my participants were talking, there were lots of repetitions. There were things which may have not been essential. So I had to remove what's not essential and come up with something that cannot be removed. And that brings me to the, most exciting part of research, and maybe research, and probably most grounded, right? Before I was talking about history and philosophy, so now I'm going to bring it more into concreteness, into sort of here and now, and I want you also to apply it to yourself. Brings me to my results, which are, the results are the themes, something that essential, that was present in every person's account of how they use astrology, how they find meaning with astrology. So the first finding, which I talked about through this whole presentation, is that meanings are always relative to a large context. I talked about it a few times. I don't think I need to labor that anymore, but here I invite you to look at an example. This is a chart of one of the participants, and she has many planets here in the Sagittarius in her 3rd house. And you know that in the 90s, late 90s and early 2000s, Pluto was transiting Sagittarius. So when Pluto transited her planets in Sagittarius, she had a very, very difficult time. She lost her ability to speak. She was given medical drugs because she wasn't feeling well emotionally, mentally. She kind of lost her identity because the drugs influenced the way she spoke. She was in confusion. She was in fog. Her life was kind of falling apart. That was, when Pluto was contacting her, mostly her Sun, but, if you notice, her Sun and Neptune are very close together, and later on there's a Mars. The process lasted for a couple of years, but in the process, she kind of rediscovered herself. Actually, she kind of, metaphorically, she had died and was reborn again, in the sense of she stopped the psychiatric medication. She stopped the psychiatry as as her main healing method. She started to look for psychologists. She started to look for answers. She basically, her identity really changed, profoundly changed. And ultimately it led her to, even though it was a very painful time, and it affected her physically as well as emotionally, ultimately led her to a completely new professional choice. She decided to become a psychologist. She became very health conscious. She got rid of the medications. She searched for, she actually encountered astrology in the process. And so she changed. And, you know, in the retrospect, she looked at the Pluto transit as destroying her identity, but ultimately bringing her, maybe healing, or bringing her rather, not the Pluto brought her healing, but she was brought to healing as a result of that transit. So as difficult as it was, actually looking at that experience and correlating it with Pluto transit helped her to make sense out of it, right? So again, one of the other points that I want to make, why is that so great then when we find meaning? Because it makes it more reasonable. There's more purpose to our lives, right? It places it into a context. And also it illuminates our subjective experiences. So it's not just her, not this person, not this participant suffering. It's somehow meant to be, or it has a beneficial purpose for her, and it illuminates her experience from more self-centered into more universe-centered. Like, how does it fit into my life more globally, or how do I even fit as a person into the, into the world? Where is my place in the world? So that brings me to the second finding, that meanings emerge in the process of comparison, and that finding finds a lot of support. Other research is found that for the psychological research, truly we find meanings in comparing one thing to the other. Again, it's relative, right? And literal and symbolic are very, the astrology is particularly useful because of the symbolic language that it has, right? So we have the myth, the metaphor, then we compare it to our experience, and then some new meaning occurs, right? Some new meaning emerges. So here is another chart, another participant. Again, if you notice, she has Neptune and Moon conjunction in the 8th house. Also, she has Uranus very strong on her 7th house in the descendant. So this participant had lots of dramatic, very difficult experiences. A couple of things that she shared was that, for example, Uranus on her descendant, she first thought of it literally. When she studied astrology, she thought of it literally, and she thought that, oh, my husband is going to die, or, there will be sudden separation from my husband, and she was fearful. Later, it actually happened that there was a sudden separation with her husband, and there were lots of difficult things that accompanied it, but she realized through this process, she got in touch with her great interest in astrology. As a matter of fact, she lost her very traditional and left her very traditional lifestyle. She's a Taurus, so, traditional sort of values of security and financial security were very important for her, but she left it as a result of a divorce and, a shock that she experienced, and she became an astrologer, professional astrologer. So she realized and she recognized that it was her own need, her own unconscious need. That's how she understood the Uranus on her 7th house cast from descendant, to become free, to come in touch with her eccentric interest to be an astrologer, right? To be the very Uranian person that she was in some level. But here basically notice that her meaning shifted from literal, and she was afraid, to symbolic, and it was then empowering and sort of helped her to deal with the experience, right? To make this experience as more meaningful and beneficial for her. And then it brings me to the third finding, that astrology serves as a system of guidance. Truly, that's probably, again, one of the most finding. Astrology is a system of spiritual guidance. And most people, now I'm giving you concrete examples, but all of the people had that as a theme, right, in their charts, and in their experience. And I'm also inviting you to check yourself. What is it that brings you to astrology? Is that the meaning, the guidance that you're looking for? Is it some kind of bigger picture, the purposefulness of your life, right? What is it that brings you to astrology? Many of my participants said that, finding meaning, it could be in reforming their professional purpose. Following astrology as a system of guidance. And for example, here I included the chart of the third participant, Hardy. All names are, that is pseudonyms, right? Pseudonyms. So, so they were replaced. They're not actual names for the privacy protection. But here, Hardy is a very strong entrepreneur. and he's an astrologer as well. He told me that, and that, wasn't the only, the other participants were talking about the same theme, that he just simply couldn't find a system of meaning that would explain his experiences. He was brought up in a Christian family, and he was just going to the church, but he was not finding, it didn't resonate with him. It didn't explain his experiences to him. He couldn't find meaning in that. So he kind of let go of that, and he found astrology. He encountered astrology, and that illuminated his experience, that reaffirmed himself, and that became his system of meaning and his profession. So all of my participants say that they come to astrology as a system of guidance. They turn to spiritual guidance, and apparently that's very important, that without such guidance, we feel lost, people feel lost, especially when difficult or chaotic situations occur.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
Can you please elaborate on Marianne's shift from literal to more symbolic thinking and perception? Do you have an example to explain the distinction?
Sure. So literally, at the beginning, she was thinking Uranus means a separation from my husband. He's going to die, something awful is going to happen. And she was very fearful. And she didn't have she didn't know what to expect, but she was afraid. So notice when she thought of it literally, it kind of made her fearful, right? Because it's something fateful. Astrology means that something difficult is going to happen with me and my marriage and my husband, right? And it did happen. The separation occurred. It was very sudden and very abrupt. And in spite of her knowledge, she actually wasn't prepared, and she didn't anticipate it happened like this. But as she reflected on it, actually her meaning shifted over the time. So as she reflected on this for the years, it took a couple of years of divorce and some difficult battle with her ex-husband, she realized it's for the better. It's meant to be, because I'm a Uranian person. I am eccentric. I couldn't stay in this relationship. I actually have to find my own voice, and my voice is astrology. And her husband was not. Her husband brought it up on her in some way. That the experience of separation brought it up on her. So later she stopped. She overcame the literal, right? She wasn't fearful anymore, and she actually considered it as a beneficial experience for her, because it brought her in touch with who she really wanted to be, who she really was. So that become more, and again, if you notice, symbolic interpretation or more global interpretation made it more purposeful for her, right? It made it more, so symbolic is here, I'm eccentric, I'm Uranian, I'm an astrologer. That's what my unconscious need, that's me, actually, it's not my husband, and so that's what she made out of it.
So the symbolic was less deterministic for her.
Exactly, right, exactly. And this participant, particularly Marianne, is a professional astrologer. Again, that's not her real name, and she does see astrology in a very sort of potential way, right? She says, yes, we have lessons, we have things which are fated, but in general, it's all about us. I choose that on the soul level. I choose the husband. I choose that experience. She also had very difficult experience with ex-husband deceiving her. Notice the Moon, Neptune conjunction. Her mom deceiving her. And again, they were very, very difficult, but she said, well, it was still my choice. It was beneficial because I, reestablished my boundaries. I became clearer. I had to do the right thing for myself, so she made lots of meanings out of it. But the point is, when it was literal for her, it was fearful. When she made it more global, more symbolic, it became more positive, it made sense, right? It made somehow purpose. And actually she felt empowered. She says, I'm making those choices. This is my soul choice.
So in that period, as she's working with that, was she also seeing transits of Uranus so that it was amplifying her fears, or was it just simply in understanding her natal chart? Do you know?
There was a transit which I don't remember right now what it was, but I do remember, again, notice that her Moon and the Neptune were in Sagittarius, so all of them, there was a deception, on the side of husband, financial deception. There was a deception on her mom's side. They were basically trying to get her resources. So all of that happened when Pluto was transiting her Moon, Neptune in Sagittarius in the 8th house, right? So the 8th house finances of other people, right? The Moon, Neptune, the Moon is mother also, right? The mother. But anyway, the Moon, Neptune, her own ideals and idealizations of her mom, her relationship. She was talking also about motherhood, how Pluto tore apart her ideas of motherhood. So all of this was very Plutonian. I think there was something with Uranus, but I don't remember the exact specifics when the divorce happened. I don't know, maybe it was a square of Uranus to Uranus, but I don't remember right now. What I did notice with all of my participants, though, there were very strong Pluto transits. All of them spoke about Pluto. They had strongly Plutonian charts. Well, for Mary Ann, Pluto is also strong because it's in opposition with her Venus, right? So there are issues of power struggles in relationships. She also talked about that. But here I wanted to give the example because of Uranus, of how it changed for her from literal to symbolic. And actually that made it more purposeful, more meaningful, more broad.
Thank you.
So I spoke about the system of guidance, right? And that brings me to the psychological benefits of study of astrology. Again, the previous research, even although skeptically minded about astrology, found it has psychological benefits. And what are those benefits? Self-validation, self-identification. It seems like all of my participants, and again, corresponds with the previous studies, we do find something reassuring, something helpful, something meaningful when we know ourselves better. I know it in my psychological practice when people find something about themselves, when I reflect something about them, and it's true, it somehow makes sense. It makes them feel better. There's something about knowing oneself that increases meaningfulness, increases comfort, I would say, even some kind of internal comfort, like it has a purpose, it has a meaning. And so self-validation, like, in my example with Hardy, he had some doubts about himself, but let me show you his chart. But he reaffirmed himself. He was doing computer. He was working in the computer industry, but his love, his passion was astrology. So at some point he decided to follow that, and he became a professional astrologer, and he became engaged. I don't want to disclose too many details because he might be recognized, but he became very prominent in the astrological world. He had stopped his traditional career, but he had some doubts. But he told me that knowing his chart, it reaffirmed that this is his purpose. He's meant to be an entrepreneur. His love of astrology. He didn't specifically attribute it to Jupiter or this and that, but he said he reaffirmed his purpose. And if you notice how strong his 10th house, right, the Pluto, the Moon, Mars are close to his midheaven, right? Saturn is a little bit on the side, but astrology helped him to reaffirm himself, to make sure that this is what he's meant to do. So somehow it helps people, right? Self-validation, self-identification. Astrology also increases sense of certainty and purpose, like in case of Mary Ann. There's purpose to her suffering, right? So there's purpose to, and that again correlates with what Frankl was saying about his own experience as a Holocaust survivor. When you have, his saying was, if you have a why, you can tolerate any how, right? So whatever happens to you, no matter how awful the experience might be, if you have a why, if you have meaning, you can tolerate it, you can deal with it, right? So astrology helps people, gets them more certainty, gets them more purpose, and then it feels better, it helps, psychologically. And then when used literally, as I talked earlier, and Anita asked me this question, astrology is usually taken more concretely and deterministically. And when it's used symbolically, it helps to find more meaning, because symbols, metaphors, they allow us to create bigger meanings, right? There's more to include in that. Again, all of this is very much correlates to the 4 or 5 previous studies, and people said, well, we don't believe in astrology, it's not a science, but actually what we found is that it increases sense of certainty, it helps people psychologically. That could be one of the reasons, why we're attracted to it. I remember my teacher used to say, well, Saturnine people like astrology because we like to be in control of the future. So, there's probably truth to that as well. We like certainty. It's hard to tolerate uncertainty, right? And astrology provides that system of guidance, of some kind of schema, structure of the universe, right? So for those who are more anxious and, like to control the future, I'm slightly joking, that's one of the appeals. And then that brings me to my next point, finding language of astrology is very suitable for meaning making. It is metaphoric, we saw that, in the examples, and also metaphor itself, I talked about it, how it helps to increase the meaning, find the meaning. Language of astrology is very fluid. What do I mean by that? It means that meaning can change, they reorganize when literal and symbolic are compared. So in the process of her meaning reorganization, Mary Ann, for example, came to a new meaning, that actually it was purposeful, it was good, and it was all right in spite of the difficult experiences, right? So or she could have stayed, and she told me, actually, she repeatedly told me, I never consider myself a victim. I don't feel that I'm victimized. So there was like a positive meaning that she found as a result. Or, she took it completely literally, or if she took it very deterministically, she could say, I'm suffering, it's unfair. My husband betrayed me, my mom, betrayed me, and, that's all there is to it. So it's, again, what do we do with the meaning, right? So reorganization of meaning is helpful, when the new meaning, bigger meaning, more positive meaning is found. And that the process of meaning making as reorganization, as expansion or change of original meaning is what, in the process of, in the psychology, that's what the meaning making theories are talking about, right? That's what the meanings are really something new, something different, or some kind of, in comparison, something new is born that illuminates our experience, our lives. And that brings me to the one of the last points of what I found, with the theme that I discovered, that understanding of self and others contributes to the sense of meaning. It seems like a lot of the participants talked about that when they understand themselves, when they understand relationships, it helps them, right? It makes it more, life more, like there's more navigation. It's really like a navigation of life. For example, in this is my fourth participant. I put his chart here. Again, notice he has Pluto, Uranus, strong Pluto chart, but this man has a very strong, he has a Moon in Sagittarius, Venus in Pisces. They're in a challenging square aspect. Venus is in opposition with Pluto, right, in opposition. So he was talking a lot about the T-square in his chart, Venus relating, right, and his stories were a lot about relationship. His relationship with his mother, the Moon, Pluto square, his relationships with women, Venus, Pluto square. And he was talking about how he likes freedom, Moon and Sagittarius, right? There's this drive for freedom. He doesn't want to be tied down, but at the same time, he wants to help, merge, have that sacrificial quality about himself, Venus and Pisces, and they are like in conflict all the time. And he said that when he understood that, and he also was quite triggered, again, the Pluto, again, notice the Pluto transit over his Moon triggered a lot for him in relationship with his mom. He moved away from his mom, and even though he feels a very strong bond with her, so he moved to a different state, he changed his life, and at the same time he longed for her, and there was this thing of dynamic of wanting to break free and taking care of mom, and also valuing the relationship very much. So astrology helped him understand that, and actually he said that it helped him to some degree free himself from that, right? Because understanding first is awareness, right? From awareness comes, that's more psychological, right? From awareness comes change in the behavior in life. And actually, interestingly enough, so Alex he was single, he was in his 40s when I interviewed him a few years back, and he had some difficulty, right, in relationship because he always felt that women are becoming too needy on him, right, and he wanted to break free. But a few years later, maybe 3 years later, I learned that he got married happily. So I don't attribute it to just astrology, but I'm saying that somehow he worked through his internal, pull and push, his fear of intimacy and desire for freedom and desire of strong intimacy. But for him, it was very, very relational, right? And that's why I included his chart here. So that brings me to the final points, I guess, in question and answers. How we're doing in the time? Oh, great, we're doing well. I'm open to questions, and I would like to just briefly summarize, kind of answer again, maybe less philosophically, but more concretely. Why do people find astrology meaningful? What are the benefits of astrology in understanding yourself and others? So in my research, I found that participants find astrology meaningful for many reasons. They turn to it as a system of guidance, a system of meaning, which is not just a system of meaning, but it's a spiritual system of meaning, or philosophical, if you like to say it this way, transpersonal. It provides a broader transpersonal perspective on their experiences. They all needed such perspective in order to orient themselves in chaotic situations, in stressful situations, to find a sense of purpose and direction. So the meaning and astrology are very tightly interconnected. We turn to astrology for meaning. We need broader perspective on our lives to have meaning. And I'm by no means I suggest that only astrology provides such meaning. Actually, I had a conversation with my husband, and he's not a believer in astrology, even though me being a practicing astrology, he actually turns to me and asks me, I do a lot of question charts for him, but he asked me, well, how come that I believe in astrology, right? Why is it a system of meaning for me? And it's hard to actually answer why. I think that each of us, all the participants can answer for themselves. One thing I can answer from my research is that we need the meaning. We need structure. We need to orient ourselves amongst chaos, right? We need to find purpose. But for me personally, it's some kind of resonance, the intuition, right, of knowing that there's something in it, right? I resonate with it, right? So that's a more subjective element of it. And then, another thing is that meaning reorganization is possible for comparison. Meaning occur when we compare things, when we compare symbolic and literal, when we look at something retrospectively. By the way, all of my participants were saying that they don't use astrology predictively as much. Maybe the professional astrologers would, but it's more of a retrospective process of getting understanding of themselves. And so astrology provides very rich metaphoric language, which is very perfect suitable for such comparisons. And like I said, there are other meanings of other meaning systems. There's philosophy, there's science, there's other spiritual traditions. So we find systems of meaning that resonate with us. But I want, again, the point that I wanted to make from the beginning, and I'm making it a few times now and then, it's all contextual, right? So there's nothing absolute. It's all in the context. And, astrology of today reflects our understanding of ourselves, of life. But, later on, 100 years from now, it might have different values, right? And it will reflect the sort of evolvement of humankind, or, new values and so on. So the meaning is evolving as we evolve, but there's always some kind of context, some kind of system. And, we needed to find purpose in our lives. So I think I'm not going to speak about applications for psychology as much, because it's more oriented towards astrological, like what is it that attracts us in astrology. And I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to close at that. And I'm open to any comments, questions, anything. But
I do have a question, and it's a practical one. The reference, do you have any references that you would recommend for the phenomenological methodology? Any books?
Yes,
or?
I will include in my presentation, my PowerPoint, I have very big list of references, but I will include references to the people that I actually specifically mentioned in my presentation, and whoever wants it, is interested, can investigate. But I highly recommend those people who are interested in philosophy, and I suspect that many people in the audience would be interested in philosophy, right, because Jupiter also is connected with philosophy. Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger, let me go to phenomenologies. All of them are profound thinkers, profound philosophers. It's just reading their, it's difficult, it sort of requires a lot of brain power, but it's mind-blowing, like thinking about the perception of consciousness. What is consciousness? So here are some people who are very paramount: Husserl, Heidegger, and Merleau-Ponty. And I will include the, the literature, the references that I use in my dissertation and in my article, and people can refer to them.
Thank you. That's the only question at this point. I think you gave a lot of meat for people to mull over before they even knew to form a question, perhaps.
Right. Well, it was very, I realize it's a heavy, philosophically, minded presentation, so sometimes it's harder to connect with it, or you can connect conceptually. But, hopefully the last part of it made some kind of connection, right, to, personal experience.
So all the people that you had in your study, they were all astrologers, as practicing astrologers, or just people who had come to astrology?
There were two people who were professional astrologers, meaning that that's what they did for a living. They didn't do anything else, and they did astrology. And there were two people who were just simply, one was a very serious student of astrology. She was quite knowledgeable. And one was simply liking astrology. So Alex, he didn't actually know. He knew enough to talk about the archetypes, about his chart, but he wasn't practicing it. It was more for his self-knowledge.
Okay. Oh, here's another question. Do you think that the future of astrological research lies in this qualitative realm? That the quantitative paradigm is really Is there any hope for that, or is it just...
You know, the jury is out, but for me, I mean, the jury is out. I suspect quantitative research can be done, right? If it's free of bias, if it's open truly to investigate the results of what it finds, like with the Gogelin's research, you know, they found that it was positive, so many times replicated, but it's still ignored. It doesn't fit into the schema. So I think that yes, there is a way for quantitative research, you know, with the agreement of what we're actually investigating, you know. So it's kind of hard. Like, how do we investigate extroversion in the chart? You know, like I said earlier, it's probably a combination of many factors, but you couldn't identify them though, right? The sun, the moon ascendant, many planets below the horizon, above the horizon, so you can identify them. So if those variables can be identified, perhaps you can research it. And also, you know, I didn't talk much about the Gagosian research, but in astrology, we know that planets on the angles are very powerful, right? So that's kind of easy to investigate, and that's what he actually found. The planets on the angles on midheaven or an ascendant, they exert powerful influence, which is observable, you know, in character and behavior. So it can be investigated. He had investigated it. The problem is, even when the results are found, can be actually accepted by the scientific community, which doesn't want to accept astrology a priori, because astrology doesn't fit into the paradigm of the science. Or empiric science, that
yeah,
is, right?
It's
so,
kind of its own little loop.
Exactly,
astrology
right.
is
the egg or the chicken, right? So can it be accepted? So context, which context consumes the other context, right? But I think if done without a bias, it can be done, you know. And qualitative research is very needed, not because astrology cannot prove itself at all, right? And therefore we turn to qualitative research, just because it's more systemic. And I only talked about phenomenology, but there are many other ways of qualitative research. It describes, you know, someone said, I think Maslow said, I don't care about those descriptions. You know, it doesn't tell me anything about what the person is feeling, what's going on with them. So in psychology and social sciences, the experiences are very important, and in astrology too. You know, so, you know, yeah, we want to predict some kind of transit, or, you know, some kind of event, but we also want to know what it will feel like.
Here's a question: as an astrologer, would you say that I am in a soul journey with my client, or more as a guide?
That's a very interesting question. I love that. I wish I could spend more time actually in my presentation on that. But I feel, you know, I think it's both. There's certainly connection with the clients who come to us, but it's a very revered position. We are the guides. And I mean, that's how astrologers have been seen always, except maybe the last 200 years or 300 years. We are the guides, and actually responsibility becomes very strong. We are actually giving the access to the divine or the mythological, right, to this, to the universal language. And at the same time, we have connection with the clients. So, for example, I noticed in my astrological practice, I get many clients. I wouldn't say there's some kind of pattern of, but I tend to, you know, the clients who stay with me, right, who find my readings illuminating, helpful, right, and stay for years, they're in always very deep, strong connections between our charts, very, very strong. And I think some of my clients might be online right now, you know, so they know they know what I'm talking about. So there is connection, you know, karmic connection, soul connection, however you want to call it. And with psychology clients, I notice an interesting phenomena. The universe is sending me the clients that have some issues that either I had myself and worked through them, or I haven't worked through them yet, right? So there's almost some kind of mirroring going on. And I think it's true for astrology clients as well. So we are mirroring to them something, but they're also mirroring something back to us.
So that brings to another question of how can astrologers go deeper into their craft and language? What would you recommend, and especially considering this idea that you brought up of mirroring?
Well, you know, it's the reverence, it's the guiding skills, it's the counseling skills that we need. You know, I think so much is to be said, you know, grounding in spiritual, in some kind of beliefs that ultimately the question is what you're believing in, right? And what are you channeling, right, for your readings? What are you connecting with for your readings? What is the purpose of your readings? Most of us come to counseling, whether that's psychology or astrology, in order to help people, right? So how could we give them information which is difficult in a way that's supportive of them, that gives them hope, right, that illuminates it? And for me, it's grounding in the spiritual practices, like realigning with the divinity in the forms that I know. So each of us we have to have connections to the higher, right, to reaffirm our purpose. And from there we can give.
From some of your descriptions, it also seems that just the old saying, know yourself, is very applicable, where your own assumptions lie, where you may leap to a conclusion that is you, but not necessarily your client.
Very good point. And that speaks to, issues that I deal with as a psychologist, transference and countertransference, meaning how much of me is in the session with the client, right? It's true the same with an astrology. When I speak, do I speak from my point of view? And I do, right? But the more I'm aware of my own biases, right, my own dynamics, the more open I can be as a guide, right? Less of me is in there and the more of guidance actually is in there.
There's one comment on the quantitative that perhaps one of the problems with quantitative is the astrologers understand the difficulties in what the symbols are meaning, but then if you get a social scientist or hard scientist looking at it without having a concept of what that perspective is, it's going to be pretty difficult for them to even accept it in their view.
The validity of qualitative research is that it applies to other things. So, if you study phenomena of meaning, that whatever you found applies to other systems of meaning, right? If you study phenomena of love, right, and it applies in any context of love, right, and so on and so forth. So that's how you make it valid, or check if it's valid, right? But quantitative are fine, but again, if it gives new knowledge about it, right? But if it's only describing something, you get no synthesis of it, then it's useless.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your attention. I appreciate your patience with the more philosophical, more sort of heady stuff. It's been really a pleasure, and I really enjoy the questions.